Hey everyone, welcome to the show. It's funny, we often think of history as this like set in stone thing, right?
Yeah.
But what if the story we've been told about the past, especially about the rise of Christianity, is only like half the picture? What if there's a whole other side, a more vibrant and kind of, well, controversial side that's been kind of pushed aside?
That's exactly the territory we're going to explore today. We're diving into Catherine Nixey's book, Heretic.
Okay, so Heretic, for those who haven't had the pleasure, what kind of book are we talking about here? Genre. Give us the lowdown.
Definitely nonfiction, solidly historical. It's not a light read, but Nixey really digs deep into the early centuries of Christianity, the first few hundred years after Jesus, and paints a picture that's, well, it's a lot more complex than what many people might expect.
Yeah. I mean, I think most of us, when we think about early Christianity, we picture kind of this unified movement, right? Everyone's on the same page, same message, spreading the good news and all that. But Nixie's saying, hold on, not so fast. It wasn't that simple.
Not at all. What she shows is that in those early centuries, there were actually lots of different Christianities. It was a real mix of ideas, different beliefs about who Jesus was, what he taught, even like the details of his birth and family.
So like multiple versions of Christianity all competing, almost like different brands or something.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Like different branches, each with its own interpretation of the core tenets, scriptures, and practices. And what's more, a lot of these different Christianities, they didn't exactly die out peacefully.
Okay, so we're talking some serious drama, some power struggles, maybe even a little violence. Don't hold back. Give us the juicy stuff.
Oh, there's plenty of drama, that's for sure.
Mm.
Nixie really lays out how this one particular version of Christianity, what we now call Orthodox Christianity, how it came to dominate and essentially wipe out many of these other competing Christianities.
And how did that happen? I mean, was it just like better ideas, more convincing arguments, or was there something else going on?
Well, there were arguments for sure, theological debates, councils trying to hammer out doctrine and all that. But it wasn't just a battle of ideas. Power dynamics played a huge role. Once Christianity got the official backing of the Roman Empire, things changed drastically.
Right, Constantine, 4th century, making Christianity the official religion. So once you have that kind of power backing you up, I guess it's easier to persuade people to see things your way,
Yeah,
right?
persuade, yes. But Nixie also shows how force and coercion played a significant role. Laws were enacted targeting those who didn't adhere to the officially sanctioned beliefs. We're talking fines, imprisonment, even violence in some cases.
Wow. Okay, so this wasn't just a polite theological discussion. This was a full-on struggle for dominance with real-world consequences.
Absolutely. And one of the tactics Nixie highlights is the suppression of texts, the burning of books deemed heretical. It's a reminder that controlling the narrative, controlling what people read and have access to, is a powerful way to shape beliefs and consolidate power.
And it makes you wonder, right? How much of this early Christian history has been lost, literally gone up in smoke, because it didn't fit with the version that ultimately won out?
Exactly. That's one of the most thought-provoking aspects of Heretic. It makes you realize how much we might not know, how many alternative voices and perspectives have been silenced or erased from history.
Okay, so we've talked about the power struggles, the suppression of alternative Christianities,
Yeah.
but what about the content of these different beliefs? What were some of the ideas that were considered so dangerous, so heretical?
Well, one area Nixie really dives into is the diversity of beliefs about Jesus himself. It wasn't just about whether he was divine or not. There were debates about his birth, his childhood, his relationship with his mother, Mary. Even his physical appearance was up for debate.
Wait, so they weren't even sure what Jesus looked like?
Not exactly. There wasn't a photograph, of course. But the descriptions varied widely. Some texts portray him as kind of weak and effeminate. Others depict him as strong and imposing. Some even suggest he had magical powers as a child, like kind of a proto-Harry Potter.
Okay, I definitely didn't learn about that in Sunday school. So if even the basic facts about Jesus were contested, I can only imagine the debates about more complex theological issues.
You got it. The nature of the Trinity, the role of the Holy Spirit, salvation, atonement, all these were subjects of intense debate and disagreement. And what's fascinating is that many of the ideas considered heretical back then are things that some Christians might even embrace today.
I mean, the whole idea of heresy is kind of subjective, isn't it? What's
Oh,
considered dangerous or unorthodox in one time and place might be perfectly acceptable in another.
Absolutely. And Nixey makes that point really well. She's not trying to say which beliefs were right or wrong. She's more interested in showing the sheer variety of ideas that existed and how this diversity was ultimately suppressed.
It's a powerful message, especially in today's world, where we're still grappling with issues of religious tolerance and the suppression of dissent.
Right. It makes you think about the narratives we tell ourselves about history and how those narratives often serve to reinforce certain power structures.
Okay, so before we wrap up, I got to ask, what was your personal take on Heretic? What stood out to you the most?
Well, I have to admit, some of the stories Nixie uncovered were pretty wild. Like, there's one about a midwife who basically checks Mary's virginity after Jesus' birth and ends up with, well, let's just say she suffers some unfortunate consequences. It's not exactly the nativity scene you see on Christmas cards.
Yeah, that's one of the passages I highlighted too. It's definitely not your grandma's Christianity, but it shows how differently people thought about these things back then, how differently they interpreted and reinterpreted the stories.
Exactly. And that's what I loved about Heretic. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about early Christianity. It's challenging, it's provocative, and it's ultimately a really important read for anyone interested in the history of religion and the forces that shape our beliefs.
Okay, so bottom line, would you recommend this book? Thumbs up or thumbs down?
2 thumbs up for sure. It's dense, it's not always easy reading, but it's so worth it. You'll never look at the history of Christianity the same way again.
All right, so let's give Heretic our official rating. I'm thinking a solid 4 out of 5 stars. It's well-researched, engagingly written, and just a really thought-provoking book.
Agreed. 4 out of 5 stars from me as well. If you're looking to expand your understanding of early Christianity and challenge some of your assumptions, definitely add Heretic to your reading list.
Okay, so we've talked about Heretic in general terms,
Mhm.
but now I want to really dive into some of the specifics. Like, who were some of the other figures besides Jesus who were seen as potential messiahs or divine figures in those early centuries?
Well, one figure that stands out is Apollonius of Tyana. Nixie spends a good chunk of the book on him, and it's fascinating stuff. He was a contemporary of Jesus, like born around the same time, and his life story has some crazy parallels to the Jesus narrative.
Okay, spill the tea. What kind of parallels are we talking about here?
Well, for starters, both were said to have had miraculous births. Some accounts claim Apollonius's mother was visited by a divine being before his birth, kind of like the Annunciation story with Mary.
Wow, okay, so already we're seeing some echoes. What else?
Then there are the miracles. Apollonius was a wandering philosopher and teacher, and he gained a huge following because he was said to heal the sick, cast out demons, even raise the dead.
Hang on, raising the dead, that's a pretty big claim. Did anyone actually believe that?
Apparently, yeah. There are accounts from his followers, people who traveled with him and witnessed these events. And it's not just his followers, even some Roman historians who weren't exactly fans of Apollonius, they acknowledge that he was a charismatic figure with a huge following who is believed to have performed extraordinary feats.
So basically we have two figures, Jesus and Apollonius, both claiming divine origins, both performing miracles, both attracting devoted followers. It's like a real-life superhero showdown.
Right. And it makes you think, how unique was the Jesus story in the context of its time? Was he really that different from other figures who were making similar claims?
Yeah, that's a great point. We tend to think of Jesus as this singular figure, but Nixie's showing us that he was operating in a world where these kinds of claims were actually pretty common.
Exactly. And it wasn't just individuals like Apollonius. There were whole healing cults, like the cult of Asclepius, the Greek god of healing, that were incredibly popular. People would flock to his temples seeking cures for all sorts of ailments.
So it was kind of like going to a doctor, but with a religious twist.
Yeah, kind of. They'd offer sacrifices, prayers, spend the night in the temple, hoping for a divine intervention. And there are tons of inscriptions and testimonials from people claiming to have been healed at these Asclepius temples.
And Asclepius, wasn't he often depicted as a kind of savior figure? Like a beard, long hair, carrying a staff? Sound familiar?
Very familiar. And Nixie points out that the parallels between Asclepius and Jesus go even deeper. Both were said to be sons of gods. Both performed miraculous healings. Both were associated with snakes, which was a symbol of healing in the ancient world.
So it's not just a coincidence, right? There's clearly some borrowing, some influence going on between these different traditions.
Absolutely. And it shows how Christianity wasn't developing in a vacuum. It was absorbing and adapting ideas from the surrounding culture, just like any other religious movement.
Okay, so we've talked about the external competition,
Right.
the other figures and cults that were vying for attention. But what about the internal conflicts within Christianity itself? You mentioned earlier that there were different interpretations of who Jesus was, what he taught. Give us some examples.
Oh, there are plenty. Like, take the idea of the virgin birth. We kind of take that for granted today as a core tenet of Christianity. But back then, it was hotly debated. Some early Christians, they just flat out rejected the idea. They said it was illogical, even blasphemous.
Wait, blasphemous? How could believing in a virgin birth be blasphemous?
Well, for some early Christians, it implied that God needed a woman to produce a son, which they saw as diminishing God's power. They argued that Jesus was simply Joseph's son, born in the normal way.
Wow, okay, so a very different perspective. So if the virgin birth was up for debate, what about other aspects of Jesus' life?
Well, his childhood is another area where we see a lot of variation. In the canonical Gospels, we get those brief stories about Jesus in the temple, amazing the teachers with his wisdom. But there are other non-canonical texts that paint a very different picture.
Like what? Give us the good stuff.
Okay, so there's this text called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which portrays Jesus as kind of a mischievous, even vindictive child. Like, there's this story where another kid accidentally bumps into him and Jesus curses him and the kid instantly dies.
Yikes. That's not exactly the gentle, loving Jesus we're used to hearing about.
Right. It's a very different image. And there are other stories in this infancy gospel, like Jesus making clay birds come to life, or even, get this, stretching a beam of wood to help his father finish some carpentry work. It's like a mix of Bible stories and ancient mythology.
So basically, early Christians were experimenting with all sorts of different ways of understanding Jesus, his life, and his powers.
Exactly. And it wasn't just Jesus. Even figures like Mary, his mother, were portrayed in wildly different ways. In some texts, she's this pure, almost angelic figure. But in others, she's more human, more flawed.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give us an example of a less than angelic Mary.
Well, there's this one story. It's pretty graphic, so brace yourself. It's about a midwife who's present at Jesus' birth. And after Jesus is born, the midwife, for some reason, decides to check Mary's virginity.
Whoa, hold on. That's getting a little too personal, don't you think?
Yeah, it's definitely not your typical nativity scene. But here's the kicker. When the midwife reaches out to examine Mary, her hand is instantly withered and burned.
Ouch. That's a pretty severe punishment for just being curious. What was the point of that story?
Well, some scholars think it was meant to emphasize Mary's purity, like she's so holy that even touching her is dangerous for ordinary mortals. Others see it as a way of reinforcing the idea of the virgin birth, like proof that she was untouched by any man.
It's a pretty extreme way of making a point, but I guess that's kind of the point, right? These early Christians, they were really pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable, what was believable.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that the Bible, as we know it today, was formed through a process of selection. There were all these other texts, all these other stories that didn't make the cut, and those stories often paint a much more complex and nuanced picture of early Christianity.
So it's like we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg, the version of Christianity that won out, that became the dominant narrative. But there's a whole underwater world of beliefs and practices that we're only just starting to rediscover.
Exactly. And that's what makes studying early Christianity so fascinating. It's like detective work, piecing together these fragments of lost texts, trying to reconstruct this lost world of belief.
And it makes you wonder, right? If some of those other Christianities had survived, if history had taken a different turn, how different might our world be today?
It's a question worth pondering. What if Christianity had developed into a more diverse, more tolerant religion, embracing a wider range of beliefs and practices? How might that have affected our understanding of faith, of spirituality, even of our relationship with the divine?
Big questions, big implications, definitely something for our listeners to chew on. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into Heretic, I just want to say, if you're at all interested in the history of Christianity and the origins of Western civilization, even just in the power of ideas and how they shape our world, this book is a must-read.
Couldn't agree more. Heretic is a challenge, it's a provocation, but most importantly, it's an invitation to think critically about the stories we tell ourselves about the past and how those stories continue to shape our present.
All right, so final reminder to our listeners, if you enjoyed this deep dive, please like and subscribe to our channel. And if you want to explore Heretic for yourself, we've got a link to the book on Amazon down in the description.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts. What surprised you the most about this episode? Did anything challenge your assumptions about early Christianity? Let us know in the comments below.
And hey, if you know someone who might enjoy this kind of deep dive into history and ideas, please share this episode with them. The more the merrier, right?
Absolutely. And until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep those minds open.
That's it for us. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.